Practice owners, if you're looking to unlock an extra $50,000 in profit, build a high-performing team, and reclaim 5 or more hours a week, then you need to join me for the 555 Challenge from the 24th of March to the 28th of March, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., 1 hour a day. In just 5 days, I'm going to show you the exact strategies successful clinics use to increase revenue, fix recruitment struggles, and optimize pricing without adding more work. Spaces are limited, so click the link in the show notes to secure your spot and start transforming your practice today.
Somebody opens a practice, they start from scratch. How does the financial operating system in that environment typically evolve?
Yes, at the start, it's a bit of a journey. It's not straightforward. People tend to run things on a gut feel. People tend to think, it's not streamlined. They make certain assumptions. They think certain things are right, and it falls into a chaotic zone. And the reason for that is, especially when you start a new practice, there's a lot of moving parts to it. Finance is just one element of it, but it's the most crucial part. If you do not set that correctly from the get-go, 6 months to 1 year down the line, it's going to be a bit of a chaotic situation.
All right, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. Today we're talking about financial operating systems and specifically the general practice financial operating system. Finance is really just another form of data. The problem is that whenever anything relates to money, there's a whole bunch of emotions, feelings, things that we've accumulated over our lifetime that relate to it. And so often what that means is it doesn't get the same attention as the rest of the data and IT systems in your practice. And so today we're just going to pull apart a way that somebody who's an expert in particularly the financial operating systems of general practices, how they approach it. Ryan Seller, GM of GP Bookkeeper, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Todd. I love to be here and just speak a few words about how finance is managed in general practice as well.
Hey, what I'd love to do before we kick off is just get a little bit of your background. How long have you been in general practice? How long have you been accountable for running financial operating systems in general practices? And then I'd love to hear a little bit about how these systems often start off in general practices and then mature over time. Over to you.
Yeah, so I've been in general practice just over 10 years now. Started from the bottom layer, I would say. I actually started on the ground, been working in reception, led my way into very basic accounting and been in the industry for over 10 years now, managing all operations in GP Bookkeeper. I've seen and actually experienced things on the ground because I got a bit of a feel of being a practice manager in a medical practice. So I gained experience for over about a year, which gave me a good feel working with the doctors to see exactly what's going on. Because as finance people, we only see the numbers, we only see the back end of things, but actually we get a vibe of what's going on the ground is important, because when we are having those important discussions with our clients, it's important to understand what they're going through as well. So that gave me a really good feel. But overall, I've got about 10 years of experience, and I'm also the only Profit First professional, certified professional in the industry, where I coach people in managing their funds using different bank accounts as well. So seeing it, breathing it, and also being a part of a manager coming from a reception background, having hands-on on accounts and the finances, and getting the view of different varieties of accounts that I've seen in the past years has been a massive benefit to me. And that's where my experience is at the moment.
Okay, I dare say there's probably nobody else that's done all of those things in the finance side. Most people wouldn't go through the reception and practice manager avenue to get here. Having that level of experience and working with the owners and the practices that you do, and just to be clear, you don't work with anybody outside of general practices, so no non-GP specialists, allied health, none of those.
That's correct.
Okay, cool. Let's talk a little bit about, say, somebody opens a practice, they start from scratch. How does the financial operating system in that environment typically evolve?
Yeah, so at the start, it's a bit of a journey. It's not straightforward. People tend to run things on a gut feel. People tend to think, it's not streamlined. They make certain assumptions. They think certain things are right, and it falls into a chaotic zone. And the reason for that is, especially when you start a new practice, there's a lot of moving parts to it. Finance is just one element of it, but it's the most crucial part. If you do not set that correctly from the get-go, 6 months to 1 year down the line, it's going to be a bit of a chaotic situation. So just to explain this a bit more simpler, what I would like to do is, if you all don't mind, just, take a piece of paper and a pen and draw a bit of a triangle for me. And in that triangle, the bottom layer is where they start off. And that's the chaotic finances. And I'll give you a bit of a walkthrough of what happens in that zone and where people actually kickstart. But then once they finish that layer, then they move on to the on-time losses, I would say. So that's the second layer. And the reason, and again, I'll explain in more detail what on-time losses means. Then they move into the occasional profit, which is the third layer. And lastly, a profitable practice. So our goal is to make sure that when we work with our clients, we achieve the profitable practice. But let me just take a step back and go into that bottom layer first, the chaotic finances. What I usually see in that area is where any business owner would want to start a practice. It could be a GP. In the recent past, I've also noticed it does not necessarily need to be a GP starting a business. And who does their finances? It's the practice manager or the business owner himself. They do not get the right advice. They do not get the experts managing this. They think that things can be done by themselves. Now, what happens in a situation like that is that practice manager or that business owner is actually not an expert. They do not have knowledge in bookkeeping. They're not accountants. And they're trying to set things up from the get-go, which actually is going to be incorrect. That's not their expertise. The other thing is, when a business gets started, time management is extremely poor. Everything is super busy and they tend to do things in a rush. Time is extremely limited. And with finance, when you tend to do things in a rush, you don't get things right. And that's the start. And that's where you're in that chaotic phase where you think, hey, I want to start a business. I've got all this up and running. People tend to go down the path of setting up their Xero. So Xero is the accounting platform. And again, any person can actually use Xero. So hence why they think they can do it by themselves as well. But then accuracy and consistency is not maintained. And the knowledge of bookkeeping that's done at that initial stage is run on a gut feel. So that's what happens usually when you see a practice manager. Like I said, their expertise is managing the practice and not managing the bookkeeping. But this is a common thing that we see at the moment in general practice. The other thing is when a business owner is pretty hands-on with the bookkeeping, usually if it is a doctor, you would see them consulting and then after hours doing the bookkeeping. Again, super chaotic and everything's manual. They tend to make certain, when even paying a bill, it's all done manually through the bank. So what do they do at the end of the day or end of the week? They tend to export that bank statement, understand what are their incomes and expenses, and they just do simple calculations like that to understand the financial position of the business. Again, as an owner, that's time consuming, really non-value adding work being done there and everything manual. So there is no proper systems being set up. They're running stuff. Ideally, what happens is they would be opening their bank account every single day to understand their cash flow situation. And the reason is it's all managed through that individual bank statement. And that's what happens if the business owner is actually getting involved and doing the bookkeeping, because they're trying to make sure that they're setting up a business and also managing the finances and structuring the finances of that medical practice as well.
Yep. If we pause for a moment, I just want to maybe give people some context. I agree. We typically see people for a variety of reasons wanting to save money. And so that means that they're kind of hustling a little bit more. Like you said, everything's important and urgent. So you kind of get this queue of things, metaphorically, a big inbox full of stuff that you're kind of working through. If we were just going to put a dollar value on the GP's time, like what's it worth, and a dollar value on the PM's time, irrespective of how much time they have, what do you reckon would be a reasonable amount of money to say this is the dollars per hour that we should value the PM at, and this is the dollars per hour that an owner should value themselves at?
On average, based on my knowledge, what I've noticed is it can take up to 20 to 30 hours per week. And the reason is setting it up, learning it as you go, because they're not experts in the industry as well. And that could cost the business over 2.5 to 3 grand or even more. And that, especially setting things up, will definitely cost over the 3 grand mark.
So for me, the numbers I use for a GP, if they're consulting, their take home pre-tax should be around about $250 an hour. That would be the kind of target earnings for me. And then a PM, when you include all the costs and everything, $50 an hour is kind of what I would use to calculate their monetary value, which is not the same as their actual value to the business, because as you rightly said, they could be doing a lot of different things. But those are the two. If people are thinking, gee, what is the opportunity cost for doing this myself? That's my back of the envelope calculation that I use. Does that sound about right to you, Ryan?
Definitely.
Okay, cool. Let's keep going. Sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to get some context around those numbers.
So I think that's the first stage of that triangle, that chaotic finances. And then moving into the on-time losses, things can get slightly better there. And how does it get better? You might hire a bookkeeper. But I'll walk you through a couple of things in that phase as well. And you could just get a general bookkeeper who has no expertise or any experience in the medical industry. People tend to think that the bookkeeping in the medical industry is very similar to any other industry. I can tell you that it is not the case. It is extremely different on how we manage certain transactions, how certain numbers and transactions are reported are extremely different. So the focus here is when that bookkeeper does come on board, they would actually follow the exact same process that was done by the owner or the practice manager, as more room for improvement because they do not have that expertise or that knowledge. Or else, what I also see, Todd, is where they actually rely on the accountant and they constantly keep bugging the accountant saying, hey, am I doing this right? What's the repercussion out of that? Is that your accounting fees keeps rising? And the reason for that is because they're going to charge you for their advice as well. So the bookkeeper will be relying on the accountant, and that's not even done properly. Come tax time or BAS time, back again, you see that accountant reviewing everything that's been done by the bookkeeper. And that's because they do not have that trust or they do not have that expertise. And they tend to review everything and double check everything and not actually having proper confidence in the bookkeepers.
Yeah, and the accountant can't be in your accountability or organizational chart, right? So the reality is they're reporting to the owner in most cases, or potentially the PM, but the accountant is kind of acting as a resource. And so they're using a resource which is hugely expensive to get kind of basic advice and guidance. And that can present a challenge because you're probably paying $400, $500, $600 an hour for your accountant's advice. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you've got a bookkeeper to have that kind of a resource for them.
Exactly. And also when it comes to having the right bookkeeper, they should be the ones guiding you and advising you with the right plugins, the right systems, the modeling of your business as well. You could definitely get advice from the accountant, but you don't want a bookkeeper heavily relying on the accountant to review every single thing. Moving from the chaotic phase to the on-time losses, which is the second stage, you're in a better position, but again, you're not in the bracket of that profitable practice where you want to be. If how I see things is leading to the profitable practice, the things that you want to look at is a couple of things which I will highlight. And that is that you want to make sure that you have the right systems in place and clean data. So what does that mean? The journey starts with setting your chart of accounts in the right manner. Like I mentioned previously, Todd, the medical industry, the way the bookkeeping is done is extremely different. And if that's not set up from the get-go, you're reporting your numbers incorrectly. You're not having clean data and solid foundations. When you run a profit and loss account using your accounting platform, you won't get the real story based on the numbers being reported because it's not been set up correctly. So one of the things that you want to first do is having the clean data, accurate accounts, and solid foundations and systems linked. And the common systems that are currently used in the industry is the accounting platforms is Xero and MYOB. I might just mention here as well, one of the things that I do recommend is going down the path of using Xero. And the reason for that is every system that you want to plug in first talks to that platform before any other platform in the industry. So the first step in the profitable practice is making sure that your data is clean, it's accurate, it's set up correctly, and you have the right platforms and systems in place.
Just some context on this, Ryan. As part of coaching general practice owners and myself in Project X, talked to a lot of owners and had a recent conversation with an owner, and their comments were they don't really understand the data. They had the accountant sharing monthly reports with them, but because of the classifications that the accountant used, they didn't really kind of have meaning to the owner where they could look at it. And so the secondary issue from this was the owner was really only focused on one thing. Did I make a profit or not? Because they didn't understand the way that they'd classified all of the accounts. And then further to that was they didn't really get a chance to have appropriate management accounts. They weren't able to build budgets because none of it kind of made sense to them. And so there was a missed opportunity. There's a big gap between what the account was presenting and then what was understood by the owner. And this person's really smart person, multiple practice owner. And I think this is relatively common where kind of the chart of accounts, general ledger, that they don't make sense to people. And so they look at it and they think, I actually don't really know what I'm looking at. Is this money in there? Is this revenue in there? Where is it all being allocated? And so we talked about this earlier, that it's really just another source of data. The IT guys say garbage in, garbage out. And so we really want to make sure that there's really high degree of clarity as to how everything's been classified, that it makes sense. Sometimes the reality is people will have personal things tied up in these finances as well, right? So you need a way of kind of being able to, I'm going to put inverted commas here for if you're listening to a podcast, inverted commas aren't great, but how are you going to manage that? How are you going to make sure that's not part of your management accounts, because it may distort the reality as well?
Todd, I might just share an interesting story there that I actually encountered with one of our clients when we started working. So this person obviously engaged GP Bookkeep, had an interesting conversation. At the first stage, it was mainly taking on their existing processes. After 2 months of managing their bookkeeping, we actually did a deep dive into their profit and loss statements. And we found something extremely interesting. And what was that? There was 2 medical practices being reported under one zero file, and it had not been separated out, and we couldn't see visually how each practice was performing. So I just did an interesting analysis on that. So I actually pulled the profit and loss, pulled it into an Excel spreadsheet, and manually started splitting all the transactions out and saying medical practice 1, these are the transactions, and this was the second medical practice. And this business owner had no clue because everything was put into one. They were making a decent profit. Everything was going really well. The minute I started separating this out, I saw something extremely scary in their business. And what was that? One medical practice out of the 2 was really draining the other practice's profits. And the reason for that is because it was all put together. No one was actually analyzing both practices separately. But we actually did an analysis. One of the medical practices was really draining the cash flow of the business. It was very interesting because as a bookkeeper, to even have a conversation like that with a client was very, in my mind, was pretty challenging. How am I going to have a discussion with the business owner? This practice has been running for years like this, and I've started taking over the bookkeeping, and the next thing I noticed was that this practice has been making losses for quite some time. Eventually caught up a meeting, had this discussion. Today, we have made a decision, and that was straight after. So after that initial meeting, within 3 months, we made some changes, and at the moment that medical practice was repurposed, and we pulled all the resources to the medical practice that was making profits. A financial position and the cash flow situation of that client became extremely better. And at the end, the 3 months to 6 months down the line, this person actually came and said, Ryan, I had no idea this was happening until you guys came on board. So that was really just some insights to show how the clean data, solid foundations were set up at that initial stage, and how much losses we could have avoided if that was done at that initial stage when they were setting up the business.
100%. One of Sachin's favorite sayings is progress begins with the truth. The benefit of having clean data is you actually do know the truth, and you're not kind of managing something that is an opinion. You actually have the information that you can rely on. So that's great. Let's move on to the next part under clean data.
Hey, if you're a general practice owner, I have a question for you. What would an extra $50,000 in profit mean for your practice? More stability, more freedom, more impact? In just 5 days, from the 24th to the 28th of March, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., that's 1 hour a day, I'm going to show you how to find $50,000 hidden in your practice, build a 5-star team, and free up 5 or more hours per week. No fluff, just real strategies that work. We're only taking a limited number of general practice owners, so click the link in the show notes and join us now. It's your chance to take control of your practice's future.
Another thing when it comes to clean data, there are a few points that come to my mind is the levels of authority in your business. That's extremely important as well. And that comes from that solid foundations conversation I was saying before. I might just give you all a bit of an example as to what I'm saying when it comes to authority. And when you work with a medical clinic, most of the medical clinics are not huge or not massive, 5 to 10 doctors on average. However, the level of authority sits with one person, the manager of the business, approving the invoices, approving timesheets of staff, processing those invoices, processing those payroll timesheets of the employees. And the next step, you would also notice them actually uploading it into the bank and approving it in the bank as well. The authority levels have not been separated out in the business, where there is actually a review process, there's actually an approval process, and the person who is actually processing the information should not be the person who is actually approving the transactions in the bank as well. However, in the medical practice, this is a very common thing that we see, and this could really lead to a high risk of your business. Usually, if there's one person doing all these things, there's an element of high risk taking place because one person's managing the entire cash flow situation of your business. So it's important that you have the right people in place, that separation of duties, the right people in place, processing certain information, reviewing it, and also the approval process. And this is not being managed by one person. So I do see that as a massive concern. And that's something that people need to be extremely mindful about when dealing with their finances in the business.
So this is a really important point, and I might just pause here and just go a little bit deeper, Ryan, just to reiterate what you've said. So what you're saying is you should be separating out the functions of approvals and uploading the information via the ABA files, etc., and then separate out the permission for the movements of money. In businesses I've worked, we've used something like Combiz in most cases. So pretty well all of the banking organizations in Australia have a business layer where you can separate, you can have an oversight, and then somebody else has the permission to move the money. Too often, all of the accountability is given to one person. And I just want to give people a really good idea about what a red flag is here. If you've got a PM that never takes time off, that everybody loves, and they kind of never ever let anybody else look after anything, there's a very, very high probability that person is stealing money. We spent a little bit of time about the variety of ways that people could steal money. And I'm going to talk about actual theft, not just kind of accidental. And so one of the accidental problems is you might have a large invoice that you'd rather space out, step out into multiple payments, or you might want to actually question the invoice. But if you've just left it to somebody else to receive it, the odds are by the time it gets to you, it's already actually being paid. So your odds of renegotiating or checking that are vastly reduced. But let's talk about the ways that people can get up to nefarious behavior. Ryan, what are the things that somebody can do if they've got all of those approvals themselves?
There are 3 points that come to my mind when you ask me that question. And one is the cash management at the practice itself. At the moment, the volume of cash transactions in the medical industry is not significant. It is sitting at around 2 to 5% at the moment. However, depending on the size of your business, that 2 to 5% is a significant amount of cash. So ideally, what happens is when a patient pays cash for the consultation, that should technically sit in a safe and be deposited every few days or at least every week. What happens is that tends to pile up. And then when that deposit is supposed to be made at the bank at the end of the week, you would see a shortfall of funds being actually deposited. And the reason for that is the manager would have taken a part of that. And the excuse could be, oh, I actually went and bought milk for the doctors and the team. And various excuses come up, but actually the money has not been utilized for the practice and it's gone into their pocket. So that cash management at the practice is extremely important. And regular deposits made is something that I do recommend so that you don't pile up any cash, even sitting in a safe in your practice. So that's one loophole that we have to be extremely careful with.
And just on that one, right, I'm going to pause for a moment and say you also need to check for reverse transactions, right? So if there's a cash transaction, there was a visit that was associated with that. If that visit is reversed in any way, then it won't show up as a shortfall of cash. But guess where that cash actually ends up? In the pocket of the reception or PM. That's something else you need to keep an eye on at a practice level. Sorry, I interrupted. Keep going.
So that's one element, and I do agree with you, Todd. It's important within the practice. If you're using systems like Praxsoft or Best Practice, they do have a banking function within their platforms as well. It's important that you stick to doing that on a daily basis. That's when all these loopholes can be picked up, like you mentioned, Todd, the reversals and everything in the system. Because if you're not reconciling that daily, if you're not depositing the cash regularly, that could lead to a massive loophole of the cash management. The second thing is, like you mentioned as well, with invoice payments, you could tend to have good relationship with suppliers and get unnecessary invoices for work that has not been delivered to the practice. So they would be actually creating invoices, sending it to the practice manager. The practice manager and the supplier might have a really good relationship in place, and they would be overcharging for services not being delivered. And then out of that, what we commonly see is the manager actually has a relationship with that supplier, and they might be taking a certain amount out of that behind the scenes. Again, the owner does not see this. The owner thinks everything's being done by the manager and everything's being managed really well. They're the ones who, that everything in my business is running smoothly. It seems like that. But when you dig deeper, it's actually not running smoothly. It's actually you burning a lot of cash unnecessarily. And the last thing that comes to my mind is like paying staff and timesheet management. You do see managers, especially long-lasting managers who have been there 5, 8, or 10 years in your business. They tend to know every single operation taking place. They've gained the trust with the owners. The owners don't actually look into it because everything's running smoothly. The next moment you see is you get some family members working as employees in the business. They might even work 10 hours on the ground, but maybe approving 20 hours of timesheets going to do their pay. So it's important to make sure that, like, if one person is recruiting employees, approving those timesheets, processing payroll, and then also making those payments in the bank, that's a massive risk that I see when there's so much control sitting with one person, which is usually the manager in the business.
Yeah, I think the reality is too, that's unfair on them. That's not a level of accountability or responsibility that most people sign up for. The other thing that I thought I've certainly seen is people setting up false suppliers. You end up with a new supplier, ABC, whatever it might be, office supplies, actually getting anything. In fact, that money goes straight into an account that is owned by the person that is accountable for those payments. And so I think it's important that we say we're not just picking on practice managers here. This is sometimes bookkeepers, so anybody who's got the oversight of the financial system all the way up to payments. The reality is you're putting yourself at risk and you're kind of exposing them to being accountable for things that happen that are fraudulent, and they might not be watching the cookie jar the whole time. So that's really useful. Thanks, Ryan. Let's move on to the next part of the way you look at things.
Yeah, the other thing is the structure, the financial operating system. And I'll just, because I mentioned it before as well, I just go very briefly on it. And that's the chart of accounts. Majority of the time when I start reviewing people's financials, their chart of accounts is not being set up correctly. And this fits with, especially on the recognition of revenue. And the reason for that is it is slightly different in the medical industry to any other industry out there. So you would see 100% of all the income being coded as income in their accounting platform, which is a big issue at the moment. So 7 out of 10 practices that I review, I see the structure not being done properly. And that's just the income side of things. When it comes to expenses as well, there's no proper separation. A lot of expenses go into a category known as general expenses. And when you want to review or want to understand what's going on there, every single line item or majority of the line items have been coded into this general expense account. Whereas one of the things that I tend to advise our clients is it's important to break every element down. And the reason for that is the minute you run those reports, you've got a clear clarity, visibility of those numbers just by seconds, rather than actually grouping everything into general expenses. So this is where it comes into that clean data, because you want to make sure that when you're reviewing a transaction, that it's being coded correctly and you've got the relevant attachment in your accounting platform as well. Majority of the times you don't see that as well. Documents are kept in a file, or they don't even have the documents as well. So these are, when it comes to that chart of account structure, there is an element of risk in that income component, which I highlighted because it's slightly different in the medical industry. And when it comes to expenses, it's just not simplified or broken down easily to navigate.
And so just for clarity for people listening or watching this, what we're talking about here is that if every part of the billing revenue, patient billings, is booked as revenue, then you're exposing yourself to payroll tax in particular, because the real revenue is actually the service and facility fee. And so that's a substantially smaller amount, typically in the order of 35%. of the total billings. And so that should be what shows up as the revenue in your business, in your medical practice. I just want to talk about, just as an aside, when you see completely mismanaged chart of accounts like that and booking of revenue, it does raise the question about getting expert accountants as well, people that are experts in this space, because that really often says that people are using kind of friends or the accountant around the corner. As you say, this industry does have different rules around the way it operates, and enough that people just walk up and try and run the show will often get things wrong. 7 out of 10 is a really big number. That's really scary. And so it might be worthwhile just briefly mentioning a few names of accounting firms that do this really well and are reliable, because bookkeeping relationships with accountants are really important to make sure that you kind of integrate your approach and that there's no surprises at the end of the financial year, in particular in the quarters. Is there any that you kind of think, okay, people I know their stuff and they're not going to let you down in these areas?
I definitely not. So I think I'll just give you a bit of an idea of the approach that we would take if we do see this element of risk as well. And then I'll walk you through the organizations that we work with as well. So once we identify this chart of accounts being at a high risk, the next element is having the conversation with the client and briefing them saying, hey, this needs to change. The next step would be actually speaking to the existing accountant. Now, existing accountant might have the expertise in the industry, might not. At the moment, we work closely with William Buck, who is a reputable organization in the medical industry and growth as well, who are brilliant experts. And the minute, if they're your accountant, you would not see this error in your financials. Whereas if it's an accountant outside who is, like you said, down the road, just gone and engaged an accountant just purposes, again, people do that for convenience. And you would see that accountant not hassling the business owner too much, because at the end of the day, they're just extremely quiet, not worrying about compliance, and come tax time, they just do a very basic tax lodgement and they get paid. However, the approach that GP bookkeeper will look at is having that initial discussion with them and trying to understand if the accountant is actually understanding the value of why it's important that it's not that this coding has been done incorrectly. And in that discussion, if we feel like that accountant is not on board with us, it's important that we raise that with the client as well and guide them to those organizations that I mentioned before, because they're leaders in the industry. They know exactly what's right and wrong as well. Whereas the accountant down the road might not have that same expertise and knowledge. So, and there are situations where the accountant might be like, yep, this makes whole sense. Let's make changes. Now, making changes, and again, I might touch on this because making those changes is not instant, and it's important to have a cutoff date. You don't want to find out the error and start making changes and changing your entire chart of accounts. That is not how the accounting industry would work. You want to make sure that you want to have a clean cutoff. And the idea behind that is at the end of a quarter or end of a financial year, and for tax purposes as well. So you put a plan in place, you have that initial conversation, then decide on the date on when we are going to make the change in the business and work towards that cutoff date. And from that day onwards, start reporting things accurately and do a complete restructure of your finances.
Yep, that makes sense. Now, what I'd love to do now is get you to give a summary. We're going to continue this conversation in another podcast. Prior to that, I'd love you to give a message to general practice owners. What's something, when you meet a general practice owner, you think, what's something that I wish they knew before they ran into me? What's your message to general practice owners out there, irrespective of the size of their business?
I think it's important that they look at their medical practice and understand the story of the numbers that's taking place. Because one simple fact is non-financial data, and me coming from a financial aspect, you might think, oh, hang on, this guy's always talking about revenue, expenses, profits. He doesn't actually understand what's going on the ground. And for me, having that experience as a manager working in reception has given me a good overview of things in the practice as well. And how I frame it to the clients is the impact of your non-financial data, how it impacts your financial information in your medical practice. And actually talking about those GP hours, talking about your CDMs, talking about private billing, touching on those non-financial aspects and connecting the dots to your financial data. Because sometimes as a business owner, if you're a GP, you wouldn't understand the value of the financials. For you, that's not going to be important. So in a nutshell, the idea is to understand your business as a story, how it connects the dots from a non-financial to the financial aspect, because at the end of the day, we want to achieve a profitable practice.
That's great advice, Ryan. Thank you. I look forward to catching up for part 2 of the General Practice Financial Operating System. See you soon.
Thank you. See ya.